We live, yep.
Perfect. So the premise is that trans ideology or the concepts, I guess, are not salient, if you will. So since that's the premise, we'll let 7242 start, and I guess Madeline can kind of respond to it. So you got
Works.
5 minutes.
Works for me.
Got 5 minutes. Understood. Okay, so let's start our presentation. Credit to Dr. Thomas Bogardus, peer of mine, not a direct colleague, but we have mutual acquaintances within academia. I hope the presentation can be seen. So the thesis of this presentation will be to answer why it is that the question of trans ideology is a persistent philosophical question. To do this, we will look at 5 common interpretations of gender drawn from feminist literature, and I will answer that the proposition that trans women are women will turn out to be false. I take it the proposition being argued for here is that all, rather than some, trans women are women, um, as that is what is usually argued for within feminist literature. We will begin with the biological view of what women are. You're probably all familiar with this. It states that women are adult human females. Arguments for this position are these are the terms that we use when we're referring to other species. That's the ordinary use of, of the word sex, gender, man, woman. We're referring to biology, and even some trans-inclusive feminist philosophers agree that this is the dominant view. Not to say that they endorse it, but it is to say that they acknowledge that it's the major sort of default view. Here's some quotations from 5 feminist philosophers who argue for that, including de Beauvoir, who wrote in The Second Sex that actually woman is a physiological category. She seems to be endorsing that view, but newer feminists do not seem to endorse that view. Um, Mostly for the reason that it seems mostly straightforward if to be a man or a woman is to have a certain physiology, then not all trans persons necessarily have the correct physiology, and so the proposition that all trans women are women turns out to be false on the biological view. This leads trans-inclusive feminist philosophers to look for another view. The reason they do this, here answered by Catherine Jenkins, 2016, the failure to respect the gender identifications of trans people is a serious harm that is conceptually linked to forms of transphobic oppression and even violence. So we need a new view, not the biological view. And so some people come up with this social role view, which I would imagine my interlocutor in the audience is familiar with. This view states that to be a woman is just to be someone who functions, behaves, or is treated a certain way in a social sense. Um, this view has a couple of problems with it when it comes to answering the question, are all trans women women? Because not all trans women necessarily fulfill these functions, behave in those ways, or are treated a certain way, right? Um, Take, for instance, trans women who do not present as women, trans women who do not want to conform to the stereotypical social roles we associate with women, right? And leaving aside those problems specific to the trans community, which social role exactly are we even talking about when we talk about social role? It's pretty hard to narrow it down. Here's Jenkins arguing the same thing. Not all trans people who are women present as women. And there are those who do present as women, but they're nevertheless treated as men. So it seems that the social role view has ineliminable problems when affirming that all trans women are women. And so on this view, it's just not true that all trans women are women. Um, that brings us to the third view, which has been rising to prominence both colloquially and within academia. Uh, this self identification view states that a woman is someone who identifies as a woman. Problem with this view is obvious. If we are identifying woman with woman, defining woman in terms of woman, then we face a dilemma. If the definition is not circular, which is to say that the second use of the word woman is not the same sense as the first, then we would need to fill in the content of the word woman in the second instance by saying, well, a woman is someone who self identifies with a certain social function or with a certain physiological structure. But if we fill in the content of that word with those earlier two views, well, we're confronted with the same problems that those views had, namely that not all trans women are women. Now, if seeking to avoid that problem, one says, oh, well, perhaps it is circular. Perhaps we do mean to identify woman with someone who identifies woman in the second sense of the word, namely that they just are someone who identifies. Then we end up with the logical circularity problem. The definition becomes vacuous. It doesn't convey meaning, and so it is necessarily false. A useful case example can be, well, look, X is a woman if and only if X identifies as a woman. Then you might ask, well, look, what do you mean by woman there, right? And you answer, well, I just mean by that someone who identifies as woman. So X is a woman if and only if X identifies as someone who identifies as a woman. And of course, we get another round of recursion. And it
Right.
goes on.
We're about done with 5 minutes, so if you could finish up your thoughts.
Yeah, that's fine. There's just more
okay.
demonstrations of the problem with the circularity of the definition. I think we grasp that. The other two views are gender abolition and gender prescriptivism. Here's Haslonger affirming gender abolitionism. Now, of course, ideally, if women don't exist, well, then, of course, ideally, trans women don't exist. So that view rules it out. And then the prescriptive view, which says that we are using an ethical command, not defining a truth on the prescriptive view. It's justified by utility. Well, the problem with that is how much utility do you have in falsehoods, right? That is, what does it even mean to command someone to think something which turns out to be true in all these other four views? And that's basically the presentation.
Okie doke.
Yeah.
Madeline, you can give your opening positions, and I'll give you an extra minute or two just to keep it fair.
Sure.
Okay, well, this was a brilliant breakdown of the different perspectives that have existed in the discourse around the issue. I personally am not here to defend a self-identification viewpoint, to make myself clear. I think the closest my position comes to of the positions discussed so far would be the social role viewpoint, but I would say that it goes further than roles, because my sort of grounding premise here is that the social forms that exist in society possess in themselves a certain reality, and as Marxists, we are not here to negate them in a pure negative sense. Rather, we affirm society as real, and therefore we're not gender abolitionists. I'm not a gender abolitionist, and I think that the viewpoint that genders based upon biology or physiology is too vulgar materialistically, because it doesn't take into account the history behind the concepts, the history behind the social roles, the history behind the words even. I don't think that the word woman can have a definition that's limited strictly to physiology, but rather, even though it can be used to refer to people with certain physiology, but rather is enmeshed in a certain social context that always refers to something more than that. So it's interesting kind of, because when I say that I'm a woman, I'm not saying that I possess a certain physiology, but rather that I fit into a certain social form of woman. So, and I would say that would be true for trans women regardless of their particular experiences in being sort of misidentified or concealing that fact from other people. So this is a kind of real transformative process, I think, that occurs when an individual lives in a society where gender is a reality and gender itself and sex are not so entirely different, because ultimately both are ways in which humans mark the human body. So from that point of view, the distinction there kind of blurs away, and it becomes clear that while there are sort of particular differences, these are sort of only relevant in a medical sense and not really in an everyday social sense or even an everyday individual sense, probably even less so. Um, if all of that is clear, um,
Let me ask a couple of clarifying questions.
yes.
So I guess, would you define womanhood as something that is more focused on how things are socially mediated and kind of the social role within like the overall the community or associates or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay. And is that the, I guess, like the only um, uh, methodology, I guess, to which you subscribe with regards to categorizing womanhood and manhood? Because if that's the only one, we can skip most of the other potential theories and just focus on this one, if that's cool
Right.
with 7242. Is that the case? I just want to make sure I'm not being
Yeah.
reductive here. Okay. Uh, cool. And then,
All right. So with that out of the way, sounds like you're endorsing perhaps a social role view, which is, um, I think if I understand your view right, you were almost saying that you would have opted for the physiological view, but that's vulgar materialism. And so we need something else to ground our understanding of gender, some other sort of material facts to ground our understanding of gender. And that can only be social role. So it sounds like you're almost saying that once we affirm the thesis of philosophical materialism, that we are left with the social role view, and perhaps you might disavow the self-ID view as being too idealistic or being too rooted in sort of in the head, so to speak. Is that about right? Am I understanding you right?
Yes.
Okay. Um,
just real quick, one more question. Do both of you, are you both arguing the premise that not all trans women are women, or that all trans women are not women? Because those are two different things.
Yeah, that's a good question.
so yeah, I'm just arguing that. So let me say a word briefly about what I take to be
Sure,
the strategy that Bogardus employs in his work, and that I'm kind of adapting here.
sure.
So usually when two people kind of you know uh, pitted against one another and they kind of get arguing over this, usually one person will say, well, I'm trans or I'm pro-trans, and I don't want to hurt them. Look at Jenkins. She said we should try to do it with oppression. Another person says, well, look at natural science. There, when we're talking about sex and gender, we talk about them interchangeably. That's just about biology. Or someone might say something else like, hey, well, in the book of Genesis, so on and so forth. And then the response from the trans-inclusive feminist philosopher will be that the starting point of the natural sciences or scriptures is epistemically irrelevant. It's irrelevant in the sense of truth bearing. For instance, Madeline said, well, it might be so that in a medical context, gender just reduces to sex, and we're just talking about physiology. If we're doing surgery, it seems like when we use sex terms, we're just kind of literally talking about physiology. But then Madeline added that that's just not relevant every day, right? So there's this move of epistemic irrelevancy used against the starting point of natural sciences or the scriptures. And so what I'm doing is showing that even within the sort of constellation of feminist views, you can't really get to the proposition that all trans women are women. Now that might leave open the question, well, aren't some trans women women? Yeah, potentially, right? But the move I'm making here is almost all feminist philosophers seem to think that's not enough, right? Jenkins says you have to end up with all trans women being women. That's what most feminist philosophers do say. Now, I guess part of our dialogue could be: is that even a sensible aim for feminism? Should we
So,
even try? But yeah, who knows?
Madeline, what is your position? Are all trans women women, or are only some trans women women? Because if you guys agree on this point, we can go for a more focused point.
Well, it seems almost like a contention over some kind of tautology, because
Mm.
if we're already calling them trans women, then it sort of already implies that they are. all women.
Okay, so I think we can keep with this prompt then.
Yeah. So okay, so then I wanna introduce another distinction, and then maybe we can really get the argument in earnest. So
Sure.
there's two kind of approaches within feminist literature. One is a kind of traditional philosophical approach where they seem to say, no, it's just always been the case that to be a woman is to fulfill a certain role or to identify in a certain way. And then there's others that say, no, it's not always been the case. That's what the word woman means. It's never been true, you know. In fact, we should do an ameliorative project, distinct from traditional philosophy, where we use this project to help people regardless of the truth contained. So ameliorative meaning like medicine, right? Like healing. And the other one just being like, no, we're just arguing over philosophical truths. So I guess maybe I should ask Madeline, to what degree are you in the ameliorative camp or in the just like more general philosophical camp of like, no, it just literally is true that to fulfill a certain social role is to be a woman.
No, I would say that it's just true.
Yeah, okay. I figured from the Marxist angle that's what you would say. All right, so then it seems to me if you're just kind of locking into the social role view, maybe we could drill down into some of the problems I see with the social role view and see where we end up on that. Also, if you want to discuss my view, because I haven't mentioned my view in this, I do have a variant of the biological view. Then we can also talk about that. So it's kind of up to you. Um, maybe a bit of back and forth can develop there. But yeah, so let's dig a bit deeper into the social role view. So I mentioned, for instance, what is the social role? What do we identify as a social role that one needs to require? Well, Haslonger, who's already been mentioned, she affirms that anyone who is oppressed is a woman. That's what Haslonger says, and I've actually spoken to Haslonger a little bit. Uh, and she sort of bites the bullet. She says, no, just literally anyone who is oppressed is a woman. So the social role she identifies is that of the oppressed rather than the oppressor. And then, of course, men would be the oppressors. Now, I would hope a Marxist would have a bit more of a fine-grained view than that. But I think there is a bit of a parallel here to the sort of things Engels says in on the origin of private property, family, and the state, where he says that the first class distinction actually originated between reproductive labor and the household. So the one who didn't own the reproductive labor, that's a woman. And the one who does own the reproductive labor in the household, that's a man. So that's kind of a hybrid of the biological and social role view. But I think what Madeline is going to want to do is take what Engels says and maybe sort of clip off some of the biology talk and say, no, 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 it's just about the role you play in reproductive labor. Um, that seems to me to be the most plausible social role, right? Oh, well, the social role of woman is not to be in control of reproductive labor in the household, right? Um, Now, let's say we do affirm that. Let's say, all right, that's what we're going with. To be a woman is to have a social role and is specifically to have the social role of not owning reproductive labor. Well, I think the problem that follows is a little bit of an explosion problem. It's not as bad as Haslonger, but we end up with too many women, is my view. Um, let's look at some households, for instance. I specialize in Greek philosophy, so let's look at the household of somebody who lives in Corinth, just anyone who happens to own a moderate household in ancient Greece. Well, it's true that what we would normally think of as women, physiological women, are not in control of the reproductive labor, but neither are children, nor are slaves. They live in the household, but they're not in control of their own reproductive labor. In fact, the slave owner, the father, and the husband, all the same man, usually, anyway, he's in control of the social labor. So I think this view, even the Marxist view, in fact, uh, at least the Marxist view shorn of the physiology talk that Engels indulges in, ends up with the same problem as Hauslonger. Too many people end up as women. Um, but maybe I'll hand it off to Madeline now, and Madeline can sort of clarify what social role they take it to be that makes you a woman. What is it? Let's drill down to this. What is it that actually makes someone a woman in terms of sociality?
This is difficult to strictly define because there are different types of women. Like there's difference within the category itself, because obviously you have
Okay.
cis women, trans women, there's a difference there. You have women who are more traditional and women who are more like radical progressive. There's a difference there, and there's women who are more like servile, and women who are more you could say girl boss to put it vulgarly. So it's like, what role is it that makes one a woman that is filled? I don't think is really what I'm saying. I'm more saying that woman itself is a social role. Not that being a woman is defined by filling a certain role that would otherwise be neutrally gendered.
Okay. So you're saying, okay.
If I could ask a quick clarifying question, what okay, so you're saying that being a woman is itself a social role. Is that correct?
Yeah.
What would you argue that social role entails?
Femininity.
How would you like characterize femininity then?
Well, of the associations that probably arise when that word is said, like a more sort of soft demeanor, more kind of focused on people than things, more sort of social orientation than technical one, um, and so on and so on.
Thank you.
Okay.
Uh,
Did you have more to say, or should I respond?
No, you can respond now.
Okay. So yeah, I want to introduce another helpful distinction. When you get into ethics and politics, right, and you're talking about social things, sometimes there just is no perspicuous definition. That's an argument that some people take to defend the self-ID view, but you can also take it here as you kind of have. Some people would say, for instance, if you look into literature surrounding the ethics of pornography, a lot of philosophers, whether they're pro or contra, will say, look, we just know it when we see it. There's no fine-grained mathematical formula for what pornography is, right? But it just kind of clicks. We know it when we see it, and there's plenty of things like that. What's the definition of a chair? Okay, what's the definition of a debate? Right? Well, I have no idea, but I know them when I see them, right? So maybe you could say something like that. You could say, well, I can't really define the social role that woman is, but we know it when we see it, right? So there's that. So that's kind of what you're doing. I guess my problem with that, and maybe this is a good segue into my views, is when I think about, okay, well, what are the social roles that are associated with femininity? It kind of inexorably goes back to sexual physiology, right? Seems to me. Why is it that we treat women as more socially inclined, more passionate, more empathetic, more emotional? Because that's what they are, according to physiology, right? And we think about the fashion that women have, it's meant to accentuate the bodies that they have, their bone structure, their genetic structure, there's things like that. We think about the medicine we give women, well, it's meant to target their physiology. So when we talk about these kind of second order social features of femininity, they seem to just supervene on, which is a fancy philosophical term for follows from or flows from physiology, right? I agree that in a certain sense, to be a woman is to fulfill a social role when it comes to femininity. But I think you're only a candidate for that social role if you already have a certain physiology. Um, at least that's what it seems to me. I don't think it's an accident that what we stereotypically associate with femininity is what makes someone a good mother, right? Um, and then, of course, what we stereotypically associate with masculinity, well, it's what makes someone a good worker, a good father, a good soldier, right? Something like that. You know what I mean? Now, to a certain extent, we could say, look, these are stereotypes. We should have a more rigorous understanding of these things, and I completely agree. But for the purposes of our conversation, I think that's my response. Yeah, okay, maybe there's no definition, but when we talk about we know it when we see it, it seems like that goes back to physiology. You earlier mentioned, if I understood you right, that these sort of medical or physiological or biological understanding of gender is not practically relevant. And I actually I find this very puzzling when trans inclusive people say this to me, because to me, someone's sex, someone's physiology is very relevant. It's relevant in the way I treat people in an etiquette way, right? It's relevant when I look for someone to date. It's relevant in what I say to those persons. It's relevant when I consider a life or a future life or romance or sexual desire, sexual encounter with that person. Their sex, their physiology is deeply relevant to these everyday considerations, these considerations of desire. Um, and from what I've been told by trans persons, that's also true for them too. That's so-called trans relationships have a lot to do with physiology, because to present as strictly masculine or feminine in a cis-coded way, they tell me, is exhausting. It takes a lot of effort, and they like some breathing room to be themselves, not put up this kind of facade for their partner. So I think, yeah, you earlier said it's not practically relevant. I think it's deeply practically relevant, and I think these sort of femininities and masculinities we talk about in a social sense, yeah, they supervene on physiology. I think that's what explains them. Why do we think that's feminine or masculine? Because that's what a physiological man or woman does, or is meant to do. But yeah, I'll hand it off to you there.
Okay, this is getting a little deeper now. I think you said,
Yeah.
I have a question. I think you said that possessing a certain physiology is what makes one a candidate for the social role.
That's right.
So, how do you think that trans femininity and trans masculinity arise in the first place, if that would be true?
Ooh. Okay, that's a good question. Is that the only question, or is it a multi-part question?
No, that's all.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked. Let's go down the rabbit hole here. So I mentioned that I do Greek philosophy. I am a Platonist, which means if you can find Plato saying it in a dialogue, I'll defend it. I don't think he's right about everything, but I will generally defend the man. I think the reason that body dysphoria arises is because there's a distinction between soul and body. And to quote Socrates, when soul enters body, it becomes traumatized. When soul leaves heaven and enters the natural world, it quickly realizes, wow, the natural world's not as good as heaven. And I think what's going on in dysphoria, both within trans persons and not, is that they're intuiting that. They're intuiting the fact that the sensible world is imperfect in relation to the heavenly world. And I think that this question of transitioning is deeply related to this distinction between the sensible and intelligible world. And actually, there's some trans philosophers who agree. I've spoken with one named Ulisses Carrier. They run a Twitter account, uh, and they seem to think this as well. They think that that's where dysphoria comes from. Now, being a materialist and a Marxist, no doubt you might have a lot to disagree with there. But yeah, that's my answer. Soul enters body and becomes traumatized, and it acquires a dysphoria. And I would actually like to say that dysphoria is actually a thin jam smeared all over all bodily interaction. I don't think it's limited to trans people. Perhaps it's more acute or intense within trans persons, but I think you can actually look at cases of cis persons who have dysphoria as well. You might be familiar with a fellow named Ray Blanchard. A lot of trans people are. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name right.
Yeah.
Well, I've read some of his work, and I think that's kind of his big problem, right? Where he says, "Oh, well, look, trans women are just autogynephilic or heterosexual transsexuals. In the first case, they just want to be the object of their desire. They want to be femininity. They want to be a vagina, so to speak. Well, in my view, so do cis women, right? They also have dysphoria that they deal with, just in a less apparent way. Um, there's also, Zizek says that everyone is at that small moment of doubt when they look at the signs on the bathroom. You know what I mean? Gentlemen, gentlewomen, and so on. You always think, well, there's always a brief moment of, oh, okay. Um, I don't think it's solely limited to trans women. So hopefully that answers your question. Let me know if it doesn't.
Well, it's interesting because you start talking about dysphoria, which I think is actually not entirely discontinuous but different from trans femininity and trans masculinity in themselves, because I take it to sort of be a passing state of being rather than sort of an inherent factor. I don't always
Sure.
feel dysphoric or am dysphoric.
Right.
And also, I would say that what actually makes me more dysphoric, it could just be I'm more lucky than other trans women in the way that my physiology is. But where the majority of my dysphoria has always came from is if other people treat me or do or say things that denote that they see me, perceive me as masculine or as a man, rather than from just my own body, like in my own room in a vacuum.
Sure. Um, yeah. So okay. So maybe I misunderstood your question. So when we ask a question of like, oh, why do people feel, uh, where does transsexuality come from? You could understand that in like a first order or second order way. You could be asking, well, what makes it possible for people to feel that way, right? Or what causes people to feel that way in a specific instance, or there's a universal in a particular question. I thought you were asking me the universal question of what, considered on the whole, makes it possible for people to feel this way, and then you kind of seem to answer the particular question of, well, I feel dysphoric because people treat me in a way that I don't want. But I guess then my response is, well, like, why, like, why would that bother you? And I'm not saying it shouldn't. That's not my implication. But what I'm trying to drive at is that's not really an explanation, right? It might be true that when people don't treat you the way that you want, that you feel dysphoric. But that's not an explanation of how it's possible to feel dysphoric in the first place, right? Strictly speaking, we need a more substantive philosophical explanation. We need something that deepens our understanding of the phenomenon. Why is it the case that when someone is treated as feminine when they're masculine, or masculine when they're feminine, that they're upset by that, right? Why does somebody care about that? And I think the answer is, or should be, that gender is deeply intertwined with reproduction, and we all care about reproduction. Maybe that's a bit of an old school answer, but that's my view. I think the reason we care about sex, the reason we care about partners, is because we care about producing the next generation. And if you care about romantic partners or sex for a reason wholly separate and disconnected from reproduction, from having children, then you're kind of looking in the wrong place, right? Is my view. Now, of course, I understand a lot of people will sympathize with that, but I think that's the truth. And my argument for that is this: there's nothing you could possibly get from sexual intercourse or romantic encounter other than children. There's nothing to be gained from it, because you might say, oh, well, I want affection from someone else, right? Oh, I want affection, so that's why I go into romantic encounters. Well, you can get that without romance. Oh, well, I want intimacy, so that's why I have sex with people. Well, you can get intimacy without it, right? And I would also argue that if you're looking for intimacy and affection from people, right, from other human beings, you're looking in the wrong place, because they can't give you what you want. Try as you might, you'll go from one partner to the next, and here I quote Plotinus: you will be like someone grasping at mist. You'll be running around in shadow. You'll be looking forever for the perfect someone, your perfect love, the person who fulfills you, who gives you the surplus of desire, and you'll never get it. Because you don't want a partner, right? You don't want any particular object. You want to want. In desire, you desire, right? We love because we love the feeling of loving. We love what it feels like to be in love. We don't really want the other person, right? We want to be in love. And the only person who's capable of eternal and completed love is God, not a human. The only person who can sustain our perpetual activity of love, of wishing, of desire, of all these things you could bring up is God. It's not another person, right? What we want most deeply is the good itself, not any particular good, right? Not wealth, not power, not romance, not a beautiful body, not the body of the other sex, not the body that's masculine or feminine. You don't want any of those things, not really. You want the good. What's happened is you've misidentified those things for the good itself. And that's actually why I'm a bit suspicious of trans stuff, because I found that the trans people I know, they initially transition and they're very happy for a time, right? They get on the hormones. Maybe they might meet a partner. Maybe people start affirming their gender identity, and they're very joyous, right? I've seen that. I can't deny that. But it fades. It fades over time because they realize that isn't the end of their problems. That doesn't completely satisfy them. And I think the answer is nothing can. If you think transitioning can satisfy you, if you think anything in this world can satisfy you, you'll die miserable. So, yeah, I don't think transitioning is part of a happy life, unfortunately. But that's a lot, so I'll stop waffling.
That is a lot. Um, I, you remind me of Lacan when you start talking about desires, desiring desire. Um, but now
I read Lacan.
I have a bigger picture of your broader worldview now.
Yeah.
But if we could get back into like the particularities of the present
Okay.
subject matter.
Sure. That's yeah.
Well, actually, because I kind of lost the train that I was trying to go down. Does the moderator have any questions to further our discussion at this point? Red
Um,
Czar.
yeah. So, all right. 7242. You said something earlier about in order to be eligible for the social role of womanhood, there has to be that physiological um, element first, right? Like that's the precondition, correct? Okay.
That's correct.
So how, like, I guess on what grounds would you say that, and why? And I guess generally justify that position. And then once you're done with that, I think Madeline, if you could respond to that, then might get us back on track a little bit.
Yeah. So my answer to that question would be we can just look at goings on in trans communities, right? So the fact that physiology makes you eligible to fulfill a social role is the explanation for why people transition at all, right? So why is it that people spend thousands of dollars to get their cheekbones, their jawline, and so on reduced, slendered, that sort of thing? Because of course, to have the physiological features which consist of a smaller chin, a narrower jaw, higher cheekbones, a more slender and soft face, is what enables people to actually treat you in a social sense like you're a woman, right? Turns out looking like adult human females is the object of facial feminization surgery. And of course, hormone replacement therapy is the exact same thing, right? To take the reason why taking estrogen is something a trans person wants to do is because that's what physiological females do, right? Your body literally changes, right? You have a higher percentage of body fat. Uh, the areas where your body fat is concentrated changes, right? You begin to acquire the more typically feminine physiology, right? So I think the fact that the female physiology makes you a candidate for social roles is something that can be adduced from the fact that, well, that's why trans women change their bodies to be more like females, and of course that's why trans men also change their bodies to be more like males, right? Um, and I think, given that my interlocutor is a materialist, I think the simple explanation is, well, that's just how material causation works, right? Now, of course, you can really drill down into that and be like, well, why? Why is it that looking that way makes people think of females, or why is it that females or males look that way? But since we're not trying to get that deep in the metaphysics, that's my answer. Is the reason I think uh, physiology makes you a candidate for the social role is
Okay.
because that's just how trans people behave.
Makes sense. And Madeline, do you have a response to that or thoughts?
Yeah, it almost seems like you're starting from the end there because it's like I'm trying to get to the answer of why. It's because you're saying that physiology making one eligible for a social role is why people try to change their physiology to become eligible for the social role. But
Yeah.
wouldn't a social role already come first? In the sense that before they change their physiology, they're already also simultaneously striving to fulfill the role assigned to it.
Yeah. So, okay, there's two things going on there. So, what I'm saying, right, is that, okay, let's introduce a technical distinction. distinction between ontological priority and chronological priority. So what I'm saying is the sex is ontologically prior to the social role, and the evidence of that is we change our sex to match the social role, right? But of course, it might be that in time, yeah, okay, a trans person says, I want to be in the social role. And so that comes first. That's prior. That's chronologically prior. And then, of course, chronologically speaking, well, it looks like the sex is secondary. It comes after, right? But my point is, again, once you grasp the fact that the social role supervenes on the sex, and trans people themselves feel like they can't fulfill the social role until they get these surgeries, until they get these hormone therapies, it just becomes clear, right, that the sex is what's primary. The physiology is what's primary. Sorry, perhaps I'm being ambiguous, right? I guess what I'm saying is, look, if the social role were totally unmoored from physiology, well, then nobody would try to alter their body
Right.
to a certain social role. Yeah.
But I
Why
don't
would
think that's what.
I said? Why would they even feel the need, right?
Well, it's kind of part of my point is that I don't think that's always the case. So I would ask now, like, say somebody who has sort of was recognized to be a male physiology, but who is
Sure.
day to day fulfilling a feminine social role, and then also is recognized as a woman simultaneously. How do you explain
Sure.
that?
Well, strictly speaking, since I don't take the social role view, I don't need to explain that, um, right? Because I said having a certain physiology makes you a candidate for the social role, but I never said somebody can't be in the wrong social role, right? So
But you
you
would
could
think that would be
obviously,
the wrong social role?
yeah,
What
Could
makes it
you
wrong?
expand on that? Yeah, perfect.
yeah, okay, yeah. So I can explain what makes it wrong. So on the Platonic view, everything which is in being has a telos, which is to say it has a function. It has a place ordained for it in the cosmos, and that's what it's meant to do. What a thing is what it's meant to be. Something's identity is its ideal achievement, and to become what you are, to be what you are, is an ethical achievement on the Platonic view. All of us strive to be what we are. What we are is a project, right? We're a process of being what we already are. And so everything in the cosmos is deeply suffused with purposiveness, right? With harmony. And that includes our physiologies. The reason men are stronger, right, is because they're meant to do something, right? They were given that purpose by a divine figure, no less. And of course, the other physiology was given a different purpose by a divine figure. And that's why I think that's what makes it wrong. It's, again, strictly speaking, it's not a divine command theory. It's a natural law view according to which our physiology has naturally ordained purposes. And I don't know how you feel about teleology, but yeah, that's my view. My answer is teleology, and if you want me to justify teleology, well, then I can attempt to do so.
What if the nevertheless male physiology doesn't necessarily live up to a standard where they would adequately be able to perform the social role assigned to it by its teleology? Does it still have that teleology if it can't actually function to do that?
Yeah, I can. So it's a good point that, yeah, what about when they don't live up? What if they don't achieve it? Right? You're asking, okay, well, what if? Okay, all right. So they're all oriented around this achievement on the Platonic view, but what if they don't achieve it? Ah, well, that sucks for them. Is the answer. But of course, that's how most people are. When we talk about the ideal achievement of humanity, what Schelling calls the moral vocation of man in nature, very few people can achieve that, right? Certain religions have saints for a reason, um, and if you don't live up to it, well, then you'll have led an unhappy life. You will not have been what you are meant to be, and that will be so much the worse for you in the afterlife. Um, so that's what I would think about that. But then, secondly, you nonetheless are still oriented around that achievement, even if you don't achieve it. because there's the distinction between actuality and potentiality. So you always have the achievement in potentia, right? You always already are the achievement in the sense of potency. You've just not actualized it yet. It's always lurking underneath the surface, but it's your job to tease it out, so to speak. You already are the thing you're trying to be, because what you're trying to be is authentic to yourself. You understand, right? It's just that we're endowed with it. We have the endowment, that's in potency, and we're trying to reach the achievement that endowment is already oriented towards, and that's very hard. And to quote Socrates, only 1 in 1,000 in a generation will be able to do it. So
Okay, but the sort of line of potential to achievement that you describe, like if I apply that to myself along gender lines, I would say that that would be feminine instead of masculine, regardless of the physiological component. And I guess you would just say that that would be a mistake.
yeah. So yeah,
I
I
don't know
would
where
say
to
that.
go from there.
Well, okay. So I guess my question would be, let's say, let's not make it about let's not make it personal. Let's just take an abstract. Let's just take a hypothetical subject, right? Well, how does someone tell? Oh, I'm meant to be a man. I'm meant to be a woman. Well, how do you tell? Well, on the biology view, there's a very easy explanation for that, right? For me, it's quite easy to explain how you tell which one you're meant to be, right? But if you don't hold the biology view, then you're kind of faced with this interminable problem of, well, how do you actually tell? How do you actually know that you're feminine, right? How do you actually know that you're masculine? I mean, for me, I just say, hey, look at your physiology, right? But you're saying, no, we can't look at physiology. That's vulgar materialism. So I guess then my question would be, that's kind of a question, or my response would be, that's kind of a question for your view, right? How do you actually tell?
Are you guys comfortable getting more into the like nitty gritty of why that might be a vulgar materialist position and if the biological position holds merit or not?
Well, I don't think that would be productive because I'm not a materialist at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would
Yeah.
sort of be that would be more relevant to a different interlocutor, probably.
Yeah.
Probably fair. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I hope what I said is clear that, like, yeah, for me, you determine what your sort of achievement in terms of gender is supposed to be by looking at your physiology. It's just that easy. But then for others who don't hold my view, well, that's kind of my question for them. Yeah.
But I think it's something prior to my view that makes it so that, like, prior to my ideological view, that makes it so that a pursuit towards a masculine achievement does not ring true to me as, like, my purpose.
Okay. Well, I mean, I would say that there's. I think I would have two. I would come up with two reasons for that, because I kind of thought about that. Like, well, if it, because you might think, oh, look, 7-2. If you can just look at your physiology and tell, well, what the hell? Why can't everyone just tell, right? What's up with that? So I have two things to say about this. First, let's get a little bit more in depth about what I'm saying. Our ideal achievement is, strictly speaking, to be with God. You might remember I said that your purpose is ordained by God. Well, guess what? Your purpose is to return to Him. Probably saw that one coming, right? So in a sense, your highest purpose is really nothing to do with gender, whether you're a man or a woman, right? You're meant to be with God. Doesn't make a difference. But then, of course, to actually be with God, well, look, we're not with God right now. How do we get there? How do we get from earth to heaven, right? How do you get from the mud to the stars? How do you get from the fallen state that we're in, the corrupt state that we're in, to divine perfection? How do you do that, right? Well, I think you've got to work with what you got. I think you got to work with what you got. You got to work with the family you were given. You got to work with the country you were born in. You got to work with the body you were given. You might wish these things were different. I sure do. But I'm not in charge of that. I'm not the one who decided to be born into this family. I'm not the one who decided to be born into my country. I'm not the one who decided to be born with the way that I am. But someone wiser than me made that decision, and they made it for a reason. So I would just say we could wonder about these things until we're until we're old. We're old people ready for the grave, right? But at some point, you have to make the decision. No, these things are the way they are for a reason, right? And I have to figure out a way to be content with that. I can't change that, right? I've got to work with it. And yeah, that's yeah, that's is that a clear response? I don't know. I might have lost track of the plot there.
Yeah, it is a clear response.
Yeah. So then the second part, okay, sorry. Oh, sorry. That's why I was a bit confused because I forgot my second part.
Okay.
The second part is ignorance, right? Maybe you're just ignorant, which is not an insult. To be clear, I'm not trying to demean you. I'm just saying perhaps some people are deeply ignorant of this teleological view. It used to be, no matter where you were on the planet, most people were raised thinking things like this. Whether you were a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, or even a pagan, right? Plato was a fucking pagan. Sorry, the curse is not professional. But yeah, anyway, he was a pagan, right? And he still knew this. But today, we're not raised thinking these things. We're not raised thinking in terms of purpose. We're not raised thinking in terms of holisticness, right? I think as a Marxist, you might appreciate this point. We have a very atomistic view of the world, not a very holistic view of the world. We don't like to think of the way things hang together on a universal level. But when you do start thinking like that, I think you're always going to be brought to the point that everything is the way that it's meant to be, or it's becoming what it's meant to be. It's got to be one or the other. Everything to the smallest grain of sand was ordained with a purpose. And I think that's a beautiful thought, but I nonetheless think it's true. And I think there's arguments for that because when you disavow the teleology, you say, "Nah, I'm not into that teleology stuff." I mean, look at the results you end up with, right? You've already pointed out how vulgar materialism is. It ends up with all sorts of errors and falsehoods. How do you even begin to make sense of personhood or ethics or action or agency without purpose, right? Without function, you can't. We talk about biology. Look, you go into a biology classroom, they talk about purpose until they're blue in the face, right? They don't stop. But then, of course, since that doesn't play nice with the official materialist ideology of the English speaking world, well, then they say, but we don't mean what those dirty religious people mean. We just mean some attenuated sense of purpose. It's like, yeah, right. Of course. Of course, yeah, the religious people mean something stupid. The materialists mean something really, really smart. But I think at the end of the day, no, we all have an implicit awareness of purposiveness. I think we've been trained in our culture to ignore it. And I think it is extremely painful to come to realize that all of us have been raised thinking things that are deeply wrong and that we have to remodel ourselves. It's makes me think of Descartes, so Descartes gets a lot of flack, especially in trans discussions. They think, he separated mind and body, what an idiot, right? But think about the start of his project. He raised every belief he had to the foundations. I'm going to burn it all down, right down to the bedrock, and I'm going to build it anew, right? I think there's something about that. I think there's something about saying we've been led to believe faulty things that have made us miserable, and we have to restart. And I think when I talk to materialists, Marxists, I think they grasp the importance of raising it down and restarting, but I think they're unwilling to give up the golden calf, materialism. I think that's the final straw of the way the English speaking world operates, and I think some people are afraid of axing it altogether. I don't really know why, but that's what I think.
So I've been thinking two things. I was trying to figure it out. Either I was sort of overriding my own teleology for the sake of what I would call higher order societal concerns,
Mm,
or the issue of teleology and purpose and like intrinsic meaning, values, valuation in the world
mm,
is actually more particular, contextual, historical, and perhaps humanity manipulatable. That's a
mm.
shitty way of saying it, but I think you get what I'm saying. Than a sort of generalized static viewpoint.
Yeah.
And I think I'm leaning
Yeah.
towards the latter as the conversation goes on.
You mean you're leaning towards the static one, or did you mean you're leaning towards the particular one,
The
so to
particular
speak?
one.
Yeah, yeah. So you're making the move that some 20th century philosophers do, because it's when you, especially when you look at the continental tradition of philosophy, a lot of them are kind of sensitive to this concern. Yeah, without teleology, not a lot of things make a lot of sense, right? Giving it up is really a high cost for any worldview. And if anyone has an appreciation of German idealism, I think they'll understand that very well, as Marxists should. And so they kind of do this move that you've been doing, that okay, well maybe we can naturalize teleology and purpose, right? Maybe it doesn't need to be a static divine order. Maybe it doesn't need to be that God appeared at creation and said it will be so, right? Maybe it's human manipulable, like you said. I think it's a fine enough word for it, in that maybe we're in charge of that, right? But I guess then we get really deep into the metaphysical weeds, because then I'm going to ask, well, when we have the static view, as you call it, it's static because we think it's grounded in God. We think the explanation for teleology is a divine mind, right? That's what grounds teleology, right? But then if you say it's human manipulable, then I have to ask, what grounds teleology? If it's not from God, why should we think there's teleology at all? What causes teleology to be? You know.
It could be self-developing.
Yeah. So I think maybe this is a weird thing to say, and maybe it's not the sort of thing people say in these sorts of debates, but it's what I'm going to say. I think to say it's self-developing is to say it's divine.
How?
So, well, because I think that's just what divinity is. When you look at the distinction between what is natural and what is divine, well, what's the difference? Well, what's nature? That's the thing God made. Read any religion, doesn't matter. Be Greeks, Romans, Indians. It can be Confucians, Taoists. It can be Christians, Jews, Muslims, whoever you like. What's unique about God? Well, he is what he is. He's the self-enclosing. He's the self-identical, right? Says to Moses, "I am that I am," right? But then you look at nature. Okay, well, what's nature? Well, it's not what it is. It's always changing. It's always shifting. It has to participate in higher things to be what it is, right? Nature isn't self-developing. It's other developed. You see what I mean? Something else develops it, right? What makes grass grow? Oh, well, it's soil, water, and sunlight. Okay, well, what makes soil, water, and sunlight? Oh, well, it's, of course, the cosmological laws that natural scientists talk about. Oh, okay, but what are the cosmological laws from? Oh, well, perhaps they're from the Big Bang or a quantum field beyond this universe. Oh, well, where are those from? Who knows? As a scientist, we'll figure that out, right? Well, here's my point of view. It doesn't matter how much science jargon you put on it. It always comes back to the same problem. There has to be an eternal cause of these things. There has to be some principle that is in principle distinct from nature to explain nature. And because nature is developed, because nature changes, it must be that which is self-developing, that which is consistent with itself, is non-natural. It's supernatural, or it's divine. And I think you see a similar logic in Schelling and Hegel. I think actually, if you read Schelling's presentation of my philosophy, he just kind of says that God is the self-developing reason. And I think that kind of goes to the strength of the viewpoint that began with Plato and ended up with Hegel. That it always goes back to the absolute. It doesn't matter. Right? You can think it's matter, you can think it's nature, you can think it's history, you can think it's communism, you can think it's whatever you want. It always goes back to the absolute. And when you talk about teleology and purpose, it's always got to return, right? It's always got to. Nothing's ever complete until it goes back to the first step. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's my answer. It's the self-developing has to be divine, because the natural and non-divine world is not self-developing. It's developed by something else beyond it.
But
yeah,
I'm thinking now of like the development of nature and by development I sort of just mean alteration, change by mankind. And so if you take that to be the other, then it's sort of like the whole thing is actually also self-developing, because the other developing each other is part of one greater whole that is
Yeah.
self-developing. So I wouldn't want to sort of bifurcate reality into a sort of real and ideal space where the real is reflectory of the ideal or the real is developed by the ideal. I would rather simply say that the real is self-developing and sort of ground that divinity in the world that we already live in.
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of half agree, half disagree. So if you look at contemporary philosophy, quite impoverished, I think. In math, let's go to mathematics. I do a lot of math. A lot of people in math call themselves Platonists. They say, "Oh, well, I'm a Platonist." You say, "Well, why are you a Platonist, right?" And they go, because I think numbers are real." I just don't think they're something we made up, says a mathematician. No, in order for there to be truths about numbers, the numbers got to be real, right? And then somebody says, "Oh, well, isn't that a bit spooky? You know, what do you mean numbers are real? You know, what, you think they do stuff?" Right? And then the mathematician says, "No, no, 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 no. They're abstract objects. They don't do things. They don't have causal powers. They're just kind of out there, right? They just kind of float around, and we just say things about them, right? So they're abstract objects. That's what we would say. Since it has no causal power in analytic philosophy, we say that they are abstract. And so you're kind of saying, oh, well, look, you're bifurcating and abstracting the world, right? You're kind of saying that, look, we have to ground what's real in the ideal. We have to ground what's here in the up there. We have to ground the sensible world in the intelligible world, the natural and the divine, and so on and so forth. Well, I actually think that's what you're doing. I think it's the reverse. I think I'm the one who's grounding it in the real world. I think what I'm doing is I'm saying, look, this sensible world, our experiences, this is a reflection of the real world. What's down here was already up there. The up there is the real world, right? We don't belong in this one, right? This world is causally inert. Your experiences don't do anything. They don't have any causal power, right? You can ask any scientist you want. Ask a neurologist, ask a neurobiologist, ask a psychologist, and they say that your mental states don't cause anything. They say they rely on a deeper reality, and then they say, "Oh, well, that deeper reality is the brain," but it can't really be the brain, right? Because if the brain were the deeper reality, well, what made the brain that way, right? You know, as Hegel says, consciousness isn't reduced to somebody's skull. So I think what's going on is I'm the one who doesn't believe in the abstract. I think you believe in the abstract. I think you take what is immediate, what is given to you in the senses, and you just presume that it's real and concrete. But I don't think that's a product of investigation in philosophy. I think that's the product of familiarity, of congeniality with the world. But in reality, what is not abstract, what is living, what is in itself, what has causal power is the divine. You also mentioned, oh, well, man has the power to create, right? You said, oh, well, man can alter this world. Man can develop this world. But of course, I've already got an explanation for that. Man is not of this world. Man is from the higher world. We're here as a guest. We're here as visitors. Um, Again, the argument for that would be, I think what we basically come to is materialism versus Platonism, right? What's a better worldview, right? We've got from the question of should we be pro-trans or anti-trans? And I said, oh, I'm anti-trans for this reason. You said, oh, I'm anti-trans for that reason. And it came down to the fact that you're pro-trans because you're a materialist. I'm anti because I'm Platonist. Okay. Right? So we're now in Platonism versus materialism, basically. Here's my argument. Consciousness relies on self-consciousness. Consciousness comes from self-consciousness. Even Marx says this in his doctoral dissertation. All consciousness comes from self-consciousnness. Every thought is a product of a self-thinking I, right? He gets this from Hegel and Fichte. He also gets it from Aristotle. But it's a well-trod thought in Germany that consciousness supervenes on self-consciousness. Okay, so we get that. We really need self-consciousness. So what the hell does this have to do with materialism, right? Well, self-consciousness can't come from a brain. It can't come from matter. It can't come from history, right? Here's an easy argument. If we listen to the neurobiologists when they say that all thought, all consciousness is just one neuron activating another, They literally model it in terms of computer analogy, right? They say there's input and output relays. The input relay receives some data, gives it to an output hidden unit, and they filter the data through this cycle of input and outputs. And then these inputs and outputs, those are neurons, right? But hey, look, one neuron activating another neuron, that's not self-consciousness. We're not after one thing acting on another thing, are we? Is that what self-consciousness is like? No, self-consciousness acts on itself, right? In order to have self-consciousness, we need something that can develop itself, that is not developed by another thing. But no physical thing, no material thing is capable of self-development, right? One neuron can't activate itself, needs another neuron to do that. One atom can't split itself, can't fuse with itself, it needs another atom to do that. The whole physical world is like that. Positive charge doesn't stand alone, it stands with negative charge, right? Light doesn't stand alone, it stands with shadow, right? They're mutually developing. You already said it yourself. Everything in this world is a preordained whole in harmony where opposites function together. But that's not what self-consciousness is it? Self-consciousness is static. It's something that acts upon itself, right? So in order to have self-consciousness, we need divinity. We need something absolute. And materialism just can't provide us for that.
Well, it has to be, self-consciousness has to be socially produced for it to exist at all. I would say would be the Marxist rejoinder.
Well, that's not what Marx says. So he says in the dissertation that he says that if you raise matter to the level of the absolute, if you say matter is the cause of all things, then you've destroyed self-consciousness.
Right.
Right? So if by social you mean something material, then that's not what Marx says. But if by social
for
you mean
Marx,
something,
the social is material.
exactly my point. Exactly my point. So the view that self-consciousness is produced by sociality is contrary to Marx's view because he thinks social is material. And he says, additionally, that you can't make the material the absolute. Right? Because if you do, well, then you face the problem of how does matter act upon itself? Well, it can't. Right? And we can see that in the natural sciences. It's just, So if you do that, you destroy self-consciousness. Right? And to bring this back to our debate, if you're not self-conscious, then you can't transition. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's my argument. My argument is, all right, look, all these views for transitioning, they face these deep-seated problems. They all contradict themselves. You took the social role view, and we've taken a long road to seeing why the social role view actually is also self-contradictory. Because even if you kit it out with all these Marxist bells and whistles, you boil down to the same problem. Where is self-consciousness? You can't reduce that to matter. It can't be done, right? And to back up my argument that this is what Marx thinks, Marx was the first translator into German of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle was the first one to make this argument. He argues deductively that, self-consciousness needs to be immaterial. And Marx translated that. He was deeply familiar with Aristotle. And he says so in his dissertation, which was originally supposed to be about Aristotle. So I think, unfortunately, I think a lot of Marxists have misunderstood Marx, and they've done so because they have a vulgar materialist view, a view where self-consciousness just somehow gets spat out by the material world. It's just not possible, I don't think.
But the question here is, where is there any room for a self-consciousness that arises from some transcendent other plane in Marx?
Well, I mean, I agree that seems difficult, but I can just say as a non-Marxist, well, perhaps Marx didn't have a coherent metaphysical view. After all, why would he need one, right? It could very well be that he read Aristotle and he thought, hey, that's a really good argument against materialism, and he used it, as he does in his dissertation. But perhaps he had no explanation for self-consciousness. I mean, again, there's nothing to suggest that he really needs one, right? Perhaps his work was just focused on other things.
So, Madeline, just really quick, do you have any thoughts on self-consciousness from a dialectical materialist perspective? If not, we can just skip that.
We can skip it.
Okay. But yeah, my summary of where the debate has gone so far, that we started with, hey, look, these views that are pro-trans contain these contradictions. And I think they contain these contradictions because they have bad metaphysical views. And I think that Madeline's social role view, better than Haslanger's, to be clear, I give you credit where credit is due. It's better than that. Still has some ineliminable problems. Let me say something about trans stuff again. So, I've mentioned proposiveness, and I've mentioned achieving what you're meant to be, and I've mentioned self-development and all these kinds of fancy philosophical stuff, right? Somebody might plausibly think, "Hey, I'm trans, and that's what I want to do."
Exactly. Yeah.
I've had trans people say that to me. For instance, I mentioned a Plato scholar who's trans on Twitter. They've said that, right? And that's what you've just said. So let me talk about that. Let me meet my interlocutor where they're at. I think it's good that you want to develop yourself, but here's my honest thoughts. That can't be done in this world. I don't think. I think if you think self development is altering your body, that you're going to end up disappointed. I think self development begins with appreciating the beauty within your physical body, but it doesn't end there. It does not end there. You see the beauty within your body and you're rightly in love with it, but you confuse it, you mix it up with your body. But actually it's within all bodies. All bodies are beautiful, right? Whether it's me, you, anyone else listening to this, animals, plants, the stars, the planets. It's all beautiful, right? Beauty is within all physical things. But if it's within all physical things, if the physical things put it there, well, no, we just went over a bunch of arguments as to why that couldn't be so, right? So what put beauty within all these physical things? Well, I think all these things participate in what is beauty itself, the true beauty. There must be some beauty beyond this world that these things participate in and get their beauty from. They dip their toes in the water of beauty, so to speak. And then beauty itself just turns out to be God. And I think true self development is understanding that ascent. It's actually following through. It's not transitioning from one gender to another. It's actually ascending from one state of mind to another. And I think that's what makes humanity truly happy. So that's what I think. I think if you're truly interested in self-development, you should basically look at the true beauty beyond this world.
And you would say that would be universal, not just like trans people.
Yeah, everyone should do that. That's right.
But that doesn't sound like it necessarily precludes transitioning, regardless, though.
Well, I mean, yeah. So there's this kind of fraught relationship between soul and body, on my view, where the soul should not be confused with the body. It should not be obsessed with the body, right? If you mix the soul, which is an intelligible thing, with these sensible things, you're going to find out that's impossible, and trying to do so doesn't lead anywhere good. But that doesn't mean we should hate the body, right? The body is still participating within beauty. It's still rightly called beautiful, you know. Plotinus says that if you're not yet happy, you should treat your body as a shrine to the divine gods. You should develop it like a sculptor does his art. You should chisel away at what is imperfect, and you should flatten out what you chiseled away to make it perfect until you see in yourself God. That's what Plotinus says. So there is a sense in which you should deeply care for the body, right? And you should develop your body, and you should, in a attenuated sense, transition, right? But I think what that means is making your body suitable for contemplation. I don't think men or women, cis or trans, should make their bodies more masculine or feminine. I think their body is as masculine or feminine as it needs to be. I think what they should do is train their body to more solidly contemplate divine things. Endurance training. Learn to go out without food and water. Learn to go without sleep and rest when you need to. Learn to think about higher things. Learn to think about appreciating these things from a holistic and universal viewpoint. And train your body to be an image of that. You know, I don't think it has anything to do with gender. You see what I mean? That's kind of my view. I think it has very little to do with gender at the end of the day, right? Now, of course, you should appreciate the beauty within your gender. Don't get me wrong, but that's not our goal. we got to leave that behind if we really want to mature. And I think that does preclude transitioning, because to transition is to have not yet matured. It is I want to say something like, to think that your happiness will be delivered when you transition to the other gender, when you take hormone therapies, when you do these things, is to have a faulty idea of happiness. It's to think happiness is acquired when you acquire something physical, a more beautiful body. But that's not happiness, right? Happiness is ascent to God. And so, that's kind of my answer. If transitioning requires acquiring a more beautiful body, then it does preclude transitioning, because your body's already beautiful. You see what I mean?
Yeah, well, because I'm not working from a biological standpoint, I don't
Yeah,
think that medical transition is necessary for transition to occur. And also, someone could even medically transition without necessarily being under the predilection that they would make themselves achieve some kind of ultimate self-sustaining happiness from
sure.
it. Like
Okay, then
you can
humbly.
do it
Oh, sorry.
without thinking that it's going to solve all of your problems.
But then why do it? Is
Well, we
my
do a lot of
question.
things every day that aren't going to solve all of our problems.
That's the problem. I think that's the problem. Yeah. I think we do a lot of things that aren't going to make us happy, and that's why we end up so unhappy. Right? I think we think. I think we tell ourselves, I don't need to worry about my destiny. I don't need to worry about being ultimately happy. I'll take care of that tomorrow. And then 20 years have passed by. And each and every day you will have told yourself, I don't need to worry about God. I don't need to worry about fate. I don't need to worry about the universe. I don't need to worry about goodness. Right? Or maybe you don't even think about those things at all, and you're in an even worse position. Right? You
Just
do. Oh, so
really quick, Madeline, you said that uh, in order to transition, that doesn't necessarily have to come with biological or like sex reaffirming surgery or anything like that. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So since your position on womanhood is more like social, I guess. 7242. How would you respond to like a more social um, sense of transitioning from man to woman or woman to man, where somebody who's born as a biological man takes on the social roles or social kind of characteristics of a woman without attempting to change their body uh, in a way that deviates from what they actually are physically.
yeah. So again, my question to that is, like, why do that? Like, what's the possible reason to do that? And then of course Madeline responded, well, not everything we do has to be oriented towards happiness in this kind of highfalutin sense. And then I think, exactly, exactly, that man is doing something contrary to his own happiness in calling it good. Right? That's my exact response to this social thought. That, look, like somebody might say, for instance, I've asked other people this, and they've told me, oh, well, the reason I do it is because I don't want to be harassed. I don't want to be mistreated. Right? I don't want to be oppressed. I don't want to, so on. Right? But that problem isn't solved by transitioning. Right? And the problem of mistreatment in a social sense, the problem of who we want to be in a social sense, is we can never actually do that until we get a firm idea of happiness. Until the entire city, until the species as a whole begins to realize we cannot forestall ourselves with these cheap excuses, right? We don't need to worry about ultimate happiness. Let's just worry about the day to day. Until we drop that childish mindset, we will never advance, right? We will continually spin our wheels in the mud, right? And our species will never get anywhere. um, we should be people, high minded people, who worry about these things, who live our lives, small as they may be in the grand scheme of things, according to big principles. And I think our government should be like that. And I think that starts with the everyday man and woman. if somebody can't even if somebody can't even realize that I'm doing something that does not fulfill my own happiness and I should not do it, how should we trust this person to be in charge of our state? How should we trust this person to be in charge of life and death, right? To send soldiers into war and take our money and our property and give it up in the tax coffers? Why should we
I,
trust unwise people with these things, right?
so to clarify, I don't think Madeline's saying necessarily that it would be against uh, one's happiness, just that it's not necessarily going to lead to the totality of happiness. Is that correct, Madeline?
Yes, yes. Like, for example, when you eat dinner, you're not trying to achieve ultimate happiness. You're trying to sort of nourish yourself. There's different purposes for doing things. And I don't think we should live under the illusion that things that we do like this will lead us to a state of whole flourished happiness either, because obviously that's not true. But doing things is still necessary that don't necessarily lead in that direction.
Okay. So I think so first thing I would like to say is when it comes to achieving your ultimate happiness, stalling is losing. You ever talk to like a day trader? They say if you're not doing business, you're losing money, right? They say if you're not moving forwards, you're falling behind because the market's always changing. The circumstances are always changing. They're in flux. And in this sensible world, there's a lot of flux. There's a lot of change. Things are rapidly changing. If you're not moving ahead, you're falling behind. Maybe that's not how it should be. Maybe that's not how it is in heaven, but that's how it is here. So when you stop doing things that advance you towards ultimate happiness, you're kind of falling behind. And you will find that such sloth in pursuing your own happiness will quickly pile up and weigh on you like so much dead weight. Secondly, I think Madeline and I have a deep disagreement here, and I want to tease it out. You say it's obviously not true that these things will lead to ultimate happiness, right? I think it is. I think it's obviously true that they'll lead to ultimate happiness, actually, because again, I think perhaps not obviously. Okay, fair enough. Perhaps not obviously, but I think again, everything has a purpose. You mentioned hunger, right? Well, in the case of hunger, yeah, we have to eat, or our bodies will perish, right? No choice involved in that. You just got to do it at some point. You got to drink water. You got to be hygienic. You got to go to the bathroom. You got to do these things to maintain your body. That's necessary, right? It's necessary. To be happy, you have to be healthy. To be healthy, you have to eat. You have to drink. So I think actually, even something as simple as eating a meal is done in aim of the ultimate happiness. Now, perhaps people aren't aware of that, but again, so much the worse for them. Because in this kind of business, if you're not moving ahead, you're falling behind, right? And if you don't firmly keep that in mind, the ultimate happiness in mind, and you do these things without that careful thought, you become reckless. You become sloppy. You won't treat yourself like you deserve to be treated. That's what I'm saying. I mentioned Platonist, the very poetic quote that you should straighten yourself out until you see in yourself a shrine to the gods, right? That's my point, is we shouldn't treat ourselves this lowly. Maybe we actually do deserve this. Maybe we actually should treat ourselves as something noble enough to advance towards ultimate happiness. You know what I mean? Right? Maybe our problem is, in the first instance, we don't see ourselves like that.
So, just a quick follow-up question for you, 7242. If you pursue something that isn't directly oriented towards attaining ultimate happiness, so if you like play a video game, or if you like, I don't know, have a drink or something like that, like is that necessarily like problematic? I guess.
I mean, good question. So this is kind of a question of they didn't talk about video games, but in post-Aristotelian Hellenic philosophy, after Aristotle and Alexander, all the different Greek schools that arose in response to Plato kind of contemplate this. They said, well, what can we do to be happy? What's off limits? What's within limits? What should we do? What shouldn't we do? People ask questions like, should we go to gladiatorial games? Should we go to bars and be rowdy? Should we bet on chariot races? Stuff like that, right? These kinds of entertainments that are akin to video games. And I think, first of all, let's look at the content of the thing we're doing, right? And then secondarily, let's look at our intention in doing it. So, for example, this might be entertaining. I take my nephew to see Marvel movies, right? I don't think they're the pinnacle of art. I don't think there's a lot of divine truths shining through. But I like my nephew to have a good role model, Spider-Man, Captain America. I like him to see brave people doing good things, right? Standing up to the bad guys. I want him to be like that. I want him to learn from that. So although I think Marvel movies are pretty crappy, and if you enjoy them too much, you're probably not the most high-minded person, I nonetheless think, in moderation, with the right intention, maybe there's something to be gained from it, in the case of children. And I think we can kind of apply a similar logic to a lot of activities we do, like a video game. Well, if you're spending 8 hours on the video game because you're depressed, yeah, that's pretty bad. Don't do that. But if you're in that video game because you're trying to express something, your creativity, your intelligence, go for it. If you and your friends love to play games together because you love one another, right, as friends should, then go for it. Right, that's good.
So
Right.
kind of off of that, somebody pursuing feminine social role when they're born with masculine physiology, if that's just something like I guess akin to expressing something that they find valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me see if I'm understanding this right. You're saying that my argument on behalf of certain forms of entertainment within reason is self-expression, right? So somebody can make the case, well, why isn't transitioning self-expression? Maybe we're doing something self-expressing when it comes to transitioning, and that's the value in transitioning, right? Is that what you're asking?
Something along those lines, yeah. And Madeline, if you have any other additional thoughts or questions on that, like by all means, please add to it, because there's just a general direction I was thinking we could go.
Sure. Okay, well, I would say this. Again, two things going on. I mentioned you got to work with what you got. I think the more proper attitude is work with the body you have. Change it, yes, but change it to sustain contemplation, because remember, well, let me put it this way. I wrote in one of my articles, when we talk about the ethics of sexual desire and sexuality, I think gender is deeply implicit in those things. We're talking about an idea, self-expression, that is kind of nested within another idea. Talk of self-expression is, absent an account of self, clumsy. There's really no point in talking about self-expression unless you're ready to talk about what the self is, right? After all, how do you know you're expressing it if you don't know what it is? Or how do you know some type of expression is suitable for that thing if you don't know what it is? Well, again, my view is that we are something divine and intelligible. We're a soul from heaven. And so self-expression is to express our intelligence. When you're playing that game, figuring out a puzzle, that's good because you're expressing intelligence. When you're working together as a team, that's good because you're expressing intelligence, right? Since you are an intellect, you want to do things that express intelligence. I think that's why we're so interested in art. But in the case of transitioning, I don't really see how it expresses intelligence. That's not a way of calling it stupid. I just don't see how it expresses intellect, right? Yeah, so I don't see how transitioning constitutes a case of self-expression, because self-expression always rests on what is the self. On my view, the self is intellect, so transitioning doesn't express the self. Now, if you've had another view about the self, well, then you can make a case, I think.
Okay, let's go to Madeline. Do you have any thoughts, any responses, and
Well, I'm
anything at all?
thinking now how this squares up with the case that's most often made by, trans rights activists, that the primary reason why transgender as a category should be affirmed, trans identity should be affirmed, and transition care should be available is to alleviate the suffering of the individuals that are subject of gender dysphoria and transphobic abuse, etc. Um, how does that fit into this understanding? Because I
Um,
think those people would say that's the priority in this case, and not like, even if it might contradict, come at the expense of, or distract from the Platonic aim of ultimate happiness, achievement, and contemplation.
mm. So yeah, I take it that yeah, you're kind of saying, hey, look, I'm going to try and translate this, and then you tell me if I'm saying it right. Hey, look, ultimate happiness. All right, we should pursue that, right? But there's certain concerns that we have on a governmental and social level that are not wholly unrelated, but still take precedence in certain contexts, such as the safety of fellow citizens. You know, so yeah, maybe our primary aim in the case of guaranteeing the safety of fellow citizens isn't ultimate happiness, but it nonetheless secures the possibility for those people to aim towards ultimate happiness. And so we should do it. Is that kind of what you're saying, basically, or is that what is that? Am I getting that
Yeah,
right?
I could. Yeah, that would be the case that I would make here.
Yeah. So, um, okay. Well, then I have I have a couple things to say to that, I guess. First, um, I have looked into some of the studies, and there is good evidence that trans affirming care does lead to reduced violence, reduced alcohol consumption, reduced drug consumption, less hookups, less violence, less generally bad stuff from a Platonic sense. As a Platonist, you don't really want any of that going on, right? So you might be thinking, oh, well, then shouldn't you be in favor of this, right? Um, and I mean, I guess in a limited sense, like I am. I do think there should be medical care for trans persons. I don't think they should just be hung out to dry. However, I think there's some strong caveats on that we can get into if you want. So first of all, I'm not wholly insensitive to that. I understand that. But then second, I want to remind us that look, this might sound insane, but I'm a bit of a libertarian, right? I think small government's the way to go because government can't achieve our happiness for us. Right? There's not enough bureaucrats in gray suits to fill enough dimly lit fluorescent offices in this universe to make even one of us happy. Okay. We have to do that ourselves. And so the function of the state should be not to rule over us like servants, but to make us into self rulers. Our aim politically should be autarkeia, self rule, right? I should be in charge of me, you should be in charge of you. If you think Platonism's a load of bullshit, you should be able to live on your own terms. And if I think all that materialist hocus pocus is just as bad as superstition, I should be able to live on my Platonic terms. I think we should be self sufficient. And in that sense, I think the government should take what steps are necessary to eliminate violence, no doubt. But the government can't make trans people happy for them, right? And that's on trans people, you know, just like it's on me and mine. I don't think the state owes us something to make us happy. I think the state owes us the training that enables us to make ourselves happy. And I actually think I'm not necessarily accusing Madeline of this, but it's kind of an open-ended question. I think the way a lot of trans-inclusive activists and philosophers argue, they kind of treat trans people like slaves. They kind of treat them like the state, like they're a state-protected class or something. It's very diminutive to me and very insulting that they're like, oh, look at this oppression and violence. Look at how bad we're treated, and we need this and we need that, and the government needs to give us this and that and the other. And like, I don't think that's true. I have a higher opinion of human beings, and yeah. So I mean, I guess this is kind of a prompting of let's be a bit more specific about what we're talking about. But then like, I don't think. I think if we're in a situation where someone is being treated so poorly in society that we need the state to step in and protect them with like medical services and legal protections and so on, then we have a problem so deep the state isn't going to be able to solve it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think a lot of what you see with a lot of trans people is they are sort of rendered servile to this kind of nanny state apparatus, you could say, and sort
Mm.
of submissive to the psychiatric institution, especially, and then it sort of becomes absolutely defined by that, to where it's you look inside trans discourses, a lot of the language that they use around transitioning is directly tied to medical transition. And I think that would just be sort of ontological error, because it's like, are you trans because are you a girl because you're taking the pills, or are you a girl for a different reason? Like, you know what I mean?
Right. Right. Yeah. It's a question of priority. Are you taking the pills because you're a girl, or are you a girl because you take the pills? Well, hopefully it's the former, not the latter, is
Right.
what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, I completely agree. I mean, look, if you believe like I do, all right, so there's this cosmos made by divine mind, superordinate good, purposiveness suffuses everything, all this kind of jibber jabber mumbo jumbo. You know what I mean? Well, I think pretty much everyone's going to be able to figure this out for their own. You know what I mean? I don't think I need to. I think putting forward arguments philosophically, that's good, as I've tried to do. But I don't think I need to hammer it into anyone. I think anyone who's seriously interested in contemplating these things will come to a Plato-like perspective. I mean, you kind of already have politically, I've noticed, just in the little exchange. So, I mean, like I agree, oppression's very bad, but yeah, I think we're in complete agreement on this topic, if not any of the others, that the state can't stop that. So, and I mean, the fact that trans right activists and philosophers seem to be so confident that it will solve that is kind of a cynical move on their part. I think they know the state's not going to solve it. I think they're. I think maybe they're up to something else, but uh, I didn't come here to bemoan politics, So, but let me briefly again summarize. I think what we've discussed. So we kind of began with, look, here's the views on the table about gender. Then we kind of got into metaphysics and what should we think about gender and what's this, what's that. How do we flesh out how each of us is approaching this question? Then we did that, and then we came to this place of, oh, well, what do you think about the sociality of it? What do you think about the political aspect of it? So I think maybe is a good time for kind of concluding remarks, I would say, because we've kind of run the gamut. You know what I mean?
Yes. Is that all right with the moderator?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
7242. Do you want to go ahead first?
Yeah. So I went first at the beginning. I'll let Madeline have the final word here. Although rhetorically, a bit of advantage for Madeline. No problem. Um, yeah. So again, I think we've looked at 5 views of gender, if briefly, and we've seen how they fail to guarantee the proposition that all trans women are women. I think Madeline's view is perhaps a more refined, sophisticated variant of one of these views, the social role view. But ultimately, that social role view is kind of perched precariously upon materialism. And materialism is confronted by problems concerning self consciousness, which Aristotle posed, the German idealists picked up on, and even materialists like Marx were very sensitive of. I think that's a big flaw in Madeline's position, the inability to explain self consciousness. And so I think because Madeline's position has this inability to explain self consciousness, not to say that it couldn't be modified such that it can, I think it could. Um, Madeline's views on ethics and politics are gonna suffer for that. A small misstep in the beginning makes for a big mistake in the end, I say. And I think the mistake here is um, my interlocutor and other people I've spoken to, they think that we can achieve our happiness and the happiness of this species within this world. I think maybe after a revolution, after we straighten out politics and the sorry state that our countries are in, then we can be happy. I don't think that's true. I think if we had paradise on earth, we'd still be miserable because we would all innately know that we're not of this world, we're of a higher world. Whether you think you know of that world through contemplation like pagans did, through the prophets, through Christ, through Muhammad, whoever you think it is, I think we as a species know our happiness rests in the higher world, not in this one. And I think that's all I have to say.
All right, very nice. And Madeline, go ahead.
This was a very fruitful, interesting, and in-depth dialogue. I would just like to acknowledge that to start my concluding remark. And the flaw in my overall perspective of accounting for self-consciousness has also been taken note of. So that will be something that I will do further work on to flesh out and sort of come to a deeper understanding of that particular issue. However, I am still of the belief that gender is part of the social, and in that sense, my perspective has not been changed. However, I think this kind of Marxist versus Platonist dialogue on the issue was a productive one. So I basically have compliments as a conclusion.
All right, very nice. Really good discussion here. Very in depth, very big brain. Does anybody have any questions with regards to the audience? There's a lot of people listening in.
Yeah, everybody who's been listening to the debate, go ahead if you have anything.
Oh, somebody says, writing in, good debate. Glad it wasn't a shit show. Most trans debate go badly. Yeah, I
Right.
found a lot of people don't bother to understand trans people or trans views before they kind of criticize them, which is to me counterproductive. Yeah.
Yeah, I got like two things to say. Like one thing is like I really don't think trans people transition because they just want to be like happy or something like that. You know, I think it's just like a deep rooted like uncomfortableness, like sitting on your grandma's plastic couch, and you know you want to stop sitting on the plastic, so you tear the plastic off. You know. The second thing is like I see that cherry Pepsi behind you, Madeline. Are you gonna drink the rest of that? I mean the cherry Coke.
I might. There's like a little bit left. If you want, you can come grab it though.
Oh damn,
We live
thanks.
in the same building, so.
Yeah, that's all I had to say.
All right, fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, I do want to say I'm not going to go into a Platonic diatribe, but rest assured, I appreciate the belief, or I appreciate the fact that when people transition, they are not doing so because they want to be happy. I think I know that, and I think that's something that should be thought about deeply.
All right. Anything else? Seems like that's a no. I'm not seeing anything being typed. Okay, I think that's a wrap. Great job, everybody.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yep. And that will be that, I suppose.